In my time, I've wandered 100 different universes. From the far-forgotten past of Lordran or Albion, to the far-flung future of EDN3 or Gaia. And yet, for some reason, for the last year, the country of Verdite has always been a special place in my head. Ever since I finished the original Kings Field a little over a year ago, I've been wanting more. I knew more was coming, and I did get my wish with Kings Field 2 a few months later. However, when this series is said and done, I'm gonna run out of these uniquely atmospheric worlds explored from that amazing first-person view. And even with the fact that more games in this style are on the way, this is a bittersweet moment. For this game, it's the end of a trilogy. For you see, the last two games offered an overarching narrative about the dragon gods Gyura and Seath and their attempts to control or destroy the land of Verdite. And caught in the middle of it was the newly royal Forrester family and their close friend Alexander. And tonight, this bloody legacy will end. For good. As always, before I start a game, I like to mention how you can get it, technical issues and all that. However, I've got nothing but good news today. For you see, one of the biggest obstacles to playing the Kings Field and other From Software games is the controls. If you watch even a segment of my videos, you know that I whine about them a lot. Well, that's a thing of the past, and at least in terms of a modern control scheme with our archaic strafing buttons or triggers to look up and down. Recently, a very good person by the name of Garangorp made the Mouse Injector Dolphin Duck, which is a fork of the Mouse Injector originally made to play Time Splitters on PC. This lovely piece of kit allows you to play a wide selection of games from many titles and many consoles with full mouse and keyboard support. Now, the only emulator that this works on its own is DuckStation. I hate DuckStation. Not only does OBS blow up when you use it, but it forces ugly texture filtering that you cannot turn off. But thankfully, you can use RetroArch instead, and once it runs smoothly, you can configure the controls to your liking, and once you're in, boom, you can finally aim your swings like a champ. You might think this would break the game or make it too easy, but either you've never played Kings Field or you've played too much Kings Field. And finally, we boot up the game, get hit with the lovely ASCII entertainment all over again, and once again get a full FMV introduction with a narrator explaining what's going on again. Actually, we get two whole videos. The first is nothing but a cool video showing off that From Software finally got a CGI artist, and the second, upon starting a new game, explains the dark storyline we're going to get. 5 years after the incident on Melanant, and the country of Verdite seems to be enjoying a lush era of peace. But out of nowhere, Jean-Alfred Forrester, the king and protagonist of the very first game, had fallen mysteriously ill, becoming bedridden at least for a while. He seemed to heal, but apparently his eyes were vacant, empty, and he seemed to become a lot more harsh, evil, and tyrannical. Alexander, John's best friend and protagonist of Kings Field 2, tried his best to stem John's new evil tide, but once he realized that John couldn't be saved at all from the evil plaguing him, he tried to rush to the Moonlight Sword and Darkslayer from his previous adventures, but it was too late. John had already taken the Darkslayer and the Moonlight Sword was broken in twain. Despite this, Alexander wasn't about to let John run rampant, however, and broke up the magic of the Bloodline into 4 powerful wizards, and then, using a spell that seemed to take his very own life force, sealed John and anyone still trapped in Verdite Castle for as long as he could. So yeah, the instant the game begins, and not only has one of the previous protagonists turned evil, but the second protagonist starts off dead. 10 years since the incident have passed and the seal is weakening. Verdite is running out of time, monsters have started roaming the landscape indiscriminately killing, and you take control of a recently adulted Prince Lyle, son of the Mad King Alfred Forrester, setting off with not but a sword at your side and the clothes on your back on your attempt to save the damned kingdom. Yeah, so the plot is really fucking dark. Not to say Kings Field 1 and 2 were happy-go-lucky stories of whimsy and wonder, but there was some whimsy and wonder to balance the darkness out, even if said whimsy came at the cost of the art style looking a little funky. Not so in Kings Field 3, the art style is finally nailed down to this dark, oppressive gothic style. This bleeds right into the graphics, which aside from one garish area and one ice field, is full of darker, muted colors and a bleak, unrelenting darkness always seems right outside your door. It seems it's always night and that you never see the sun. And while the graphics are dark and muted, for the first time I think the monster designs are actually really cool and inspired. Now, to first give the game its lumps before I jerk it off, remember Tony? You know, the skeletons from the last game? Where, except in some locations, a serious threat in the early game? Well, get used to Tony because the entire goddamn bone zone came in for this game. It seems every other location has skeletons now or some sort of undead warrior. I've heard of the Headless Horseman, but I think the Headless Swordsman is taking the piss a little. I guess they really didn't have the soldiers of Necron to fall back on for grunts, but now it feels like that one scene in Berserk, which is frustrating because when the game does step outside its comfort zone, you get these guys that look like a crossbreed between both types of Zelda Zora, or how about the Emperor's finest terracotta soldiers? And if you thought those guys were chumps, how about their big brothers? A lot of the monster designs in this game are straight up inspired, and I feel like they would go on to be very familiar. I can't put my finger on it. As for what doesn't feel inspired, well, I hate to say that the music falls flat this time around. Okay, it's not bad, but if you asked me to bang out a tune, I couldn't whatsoever. It's all very fitting and subdued. And as for the sound effects, well, they mostly all come from Kings Field 2, so they're all good. As you can expect, most of the gameplay is also straight from Kings Field 2. Explaining the difference between the two games is kinda like explaining the differences between Demon Souls and Dark Souls. It's more of a really massive balance patch list rather than some massive expansion of KF2's play kit. Magic seems to regenerate a lot slower, the almighty crystal flasks are a lot less prevalent, and the even more powerful gold potion is even more rare, so that safety net has been either nulled or culled depending on your skill level. And arguably, the biggest change against the player this time is that the previously, semi-invisible hidden doors are now fully hidden doors, being damn near invisible until almost the entire end of the game, meaning if you want to find all the secrets, break out your Wolfenstein rulebook and wall hump everything. And here's a little hint: if there's two of something in the room, or if it seems to have a pointless reward, wall hump everything. There's probably a secret wall hidden in there somewhere. Also, while I gave myself a set of better controls to navigate the dance of death better, it seems the dance is even deadlier than before. I swear some enemies do so much damage to you, and bad positioning means that you can get wombo comboed half to death or even all the way to death if you're not paying attention. Not only that, it seems status effects are all over the place. In Kings Field 2, aside from poison, I could count on my fingers the number of times I was paralyzed or had my vision darkened. Now it's like dodging a fucking Macross scene. If you get hit by any one of the projectiles, then you're poisoned, have your vision entirely blackened, or get to sit nice and still for the enemies to gang up on you. However, this is from software, so everything they taketh, they giveth. So not only do you start with an honestly pretty damn cool sword for the first time, the Accelerator, but it's a living weapon that upgrades as you score melee hits. You don't need to have the weapon equipped, just in your inventory, and you start from a pretty decent dagger, to a pretty good sword, to a damn near endgame level greatsword. There is a catch with this weapon if you decide to go for the best ending, but by that point you probably will have found better equipment. We're also back to the Kings Field 1 version of some rather interesting weapon positioning. For example, one of the best weapons in the game, the Capricorn, can be found in the third area, the training grounds. It takes a lot of work to find it, but it's hinted at, and once you do, it'll carry you well into the midpoint of the game before it even starts to become inefficient. And even then, it's still good, if you can stomach the long times between swings. Speaking of the combat, now when you hit anything with any attack, the enemy will glow red for about a second, thank the gods. This is especially good because if you don't deal enough damage of a certain type, the enemy in question will not even flinch like the enemies of past games, so typing is even more important now. And also, we now have a hybrid magic system. Since Lyle is of the Forrester Bloodline, and since his father learned magic naturally, so does he. To actually unlock the magic, you need to find and visit the previously mentioned 4 wizards, usually by completing a side quest or some sort of dungeon. Nab the magic and it'll start leveling up on its own as you level up. Or you can grab a crystal Verdite, or the magic crystals from Kings Field 2 to give you an instant boost to that magic category. And with the fact that there are so many accessories, it means that you can boost the magic to ridiculous lengths and crush scores of enemies. Was there anything else that was so great about the... Oh yeah, the Triple Fang is back. It's nerfed a little bit by the healing and magic regen being slow, but it still does both, still hits like a semi-truck full of concrete, and now can be found before the hardest parts of the game. Now, there are some neutral changes, things that are here or there that may turn some people off or may make some people enjoy it more. The first big one is that the game is surprisingly linear. Aside from a few splits at key areas, the game is more or less a straight line to the finish. Well, more a sine wave to the finish now. There's a lot of backtracking to be doing, and you will need to explore these side areas for useful weapons, the magic masters, and most importantly the keys for getting the best ending. But the country of Verdite is much more of a forward march than the sprawling, constantly folding in on itself island of Melanant. Interestingly, because of this, your fast travel has been nerfed. Throughout your adventures, you'll find various springs giving off blue and gold potions. Part of the game's plot requires that you find the 3 artifacts of Icarus. Each one will allow you to fast travel to one of the golden springs, which means that you still gotta do a lot of running around, though this is rectified in the final act of the game. When it comes to the gameplay side of things, that's it. I mean, sure, I could go on about the minutia weapon drops, the cursed armor, the trapped chests, but all of that is nearly poppycock compared to the above. Softy had an if it ain't broke, don't fix it attitude that served the sequel well, so I'd just be regurgitating what I said in the first 2 videos if I kept going. It's just a bigger, beefier, rebalanced version of the second game, and so for gameplay, you get no complaints here. Now, the thing that ultimately got me about this game was the story. As per standards and practices at Software HQ, the game is surprisingly lenient on story, but also has a deep, overarching narrative hidden away behind the NPCs and story details. However, the main theme is obvious and hits right home: despair. Every town is overrun by monsters and at least one city has been completely wiped out. The king's power is only getting stronger and the monsters are only increasing. Death is all around you and the citizens of the kingdoms are losing hope. Some have already given up, resigning themselves to death unless someone can save them from this living hell. And that's where you come in, Prince, but it sure ain't fucking easy. Some of the characters also really hate your guts because you're the son of the very king who's forcing them to live like this. It's understandable some are so put off by you that some of them straight up tell you to get out the second you talk to them. This does have the nice effect of, once you help the NPC out by doing a minor side quest, they do realize how much of a dick they were being and thank you, claiming that you're nothing like John. But the pain doesn't magically go away just because you saved a child here or unfroze a person there. People seem to be in perpetual misery no matter where you go, and a lot of NPCs still have unfinished business, even when you've done everything you can for them. One of the key examples is Lynn, a dark elf woman who is Lyle's old childhood sweetheart and who honestly wants to be his adult lover, but also wants to desperately find her father who went missing. Late in the game, at the ice fields, you find her in her childhood home. Once you talk to her and receive a key item, she disappears from that home and storms a nearby den of monsters in a desperate attempt to get answers. Needless to say, she doesn't make it. I wonder how many players went on a roaring rampage of revenge once they learned her fate. Before we progress into the overall lore and the endgame, I do want to throw up a bit of a spoiler warning. Jump to this time if you want to skip the biggest reveals, but only jump to this time if you want to skip the lore and hear about the endings and their requirements. Since this is the end of the trilogy, Kings Field 3 slips in the final lore bits required to tie the overarching lore that was going on in the background. Now, something I completely missed in Kings Field 2, complete shocker, I know, is that one of the dragon tree fruit giving trees could actually talk, and when you talked to it, it explained that neither Seath nor Gyura, you remember the dragons from the last game, were neither good nor evil, but they were feuding. In a surprising turn of events, Gyura was the one to create the Moonlight Sword, and Seath created the Dark Slayer. Well, since you used the Dark Slayer to kill Gyura in the last game, the balance is now horribly upset. Or did you? Oh, and you remember that original hero from the first Kings Field that supposedly ended the war a long time ago? That likely means that Gyura was either the one who ended the war, or had some hand in it, being that the Moonlight Sword is the relic that everyone is after. Well, in Kings Field 3, it's revealed that 3 gods descended from the realm of Cyville, who created the world. Once the job was done, 2 of the gods fucked off back to Cyville. One, Valad, stayed behind to make sure peace stayed in the world. It didn't, humans being who they are. To try and make a balance of power, Valad split himself into 2 dragons, Seath and Gyura. As you can already tell, that plan also blew up in their godly face. Since Valad didn't like to kill anyone, the one time we have a truly benevolent god and it's in a game as depressing as this, of fucking course, He tried to recruit Icarus, a powerful high elf who taught an even more powerful archmage, Ordlan, to amass power and give it to the one who would finally bring peace to the world. Which is where you come in. However, you're not out of this woods yet, because for the very first time since I started this series, we have multiple endings. Now, when it comes to From Software and their multiple endings, they're either comically easy to trigger, or frustratingly complex to achieve. And I'm not entirely sure where Kings Field 3 sits on that spectrum. Mainly because, while I know what triggers the ending change, I'm not entirely sure which steps are part of the good ending path, and what steps are just required to access Verdite Castle to beat the game in the first place. Through the game, you need to acquire 3 artifacts of Icarus and take them back to Leon Shore, the man who you started the game with, and who will combine the keys into one Uber traversal tool at the cost of about 10 minutes of real-life time in depowering the Excellator back to base form. Now, if you go back to the ruins of the High Elves, you can place the newly formed Icarus key into a stone, and don't do what I failed to do and leave it there. If you die at any point in the next 2 dungeons, you need to march your way all the way back here from the very first town. And since you can pull out the key and the portals you open still work, you don't need to do that. Travel through the portals, admittedly giving one of the coolest effects I've ever seen on PS1, until you'll wind up in the maze of Orderland and further down the path, the place of the beginning. Here you'll find the tree I mentioned earlier, or at least another chunk of it, receive some powerful endgame gear, and if you did enough searching, a mysterious fairy fossil. Now, here's where I'm confused. I don't know whether you needed to do all of that to get into Verdite Castle or not, or at the very least need that to claim the broken Moonlight Sword. Either way, I claimed the Fairy Fossil and the Moonlight Sword, but right before you enter Verdite Castle, you can take a hard right and find to the Royal Graveyard. Hey, I remember this place! Hell yeah, you get to explore a sizable chunk of the first and the very final levels of Kings Field 1, down to the save point, a wooden shield, and all of the skeleton emplacements exactly where they were in the first game. It's condensed, but still such a cool treat for fans of the first game. And in here you find a— you motherfucker, that's Alexander's armor, you fuck! Kill it hard! And then you can claim Seath's sword and enter the next area, and you remember the demons from the first game? They're back.
Legalize nuclear bombs.
Survive that onslaught and you'll wind up at the room of the final boss with no real way to cross the ravine. This is where Gyura is supposed to be, right? How are we— and wait, didn't Gyura have a— oh, fuck you, that puzzle is impossible unless you played Kings Field 1. Oh, and by the way, you might have remembered that Gyura was a dragon from the first 2 games? Well, that wasn't really him. That was basically a mock-up made by one of his followers. I think Mithra was her name. His true form is— holy fucking shit, what the fuck is that? Oh, he's friendly. And he fixes the Moonlight Sword, false alarm. And now that you have the Moonlight Sword in all its former glory, you can finally storm Verdite Castle. It takes about an hour or 2, but soon you're knocking on King Alfred's door. If you have the Moonlight Sword or not, your ending awaits. Father, I'm home. If you manage to hold onto the sword, you still have one final foe to face. Pick up the Dark Slayer and enter this void to finish this nightmare once and for all. For Alfred. For Hauser. For Alexander. For Lynn. For every person who's ever died due to these cruel dragons' machinations. Seath, you're going down. As Seath finally falls underneath your relentless battle, the sun finally shows over Verdite for the first time in 10 years. As Lyle stands victorious over Verdite Castle, Valad rewards him with the knowledge that he is Verdite's chosen king forevermore, and that for his brave efforts, Lynn will be revived to take him as his queen. And for the very first time since the Dragon of the Forest first broke the war between the countries, the kingdom of Verdite will finally know true and everlasting peace. This is the final game in the Verdite trilogy, but not in the entire franchise itself. Wherever Kings Field goes, we will leave these lands behind for the very last time. Would I recommend Kings Field 3? If you played or showed interest in the last two games, then of course hell yes. It's bigger, badder, and even more grand than those two adventures. However, before I sign off, I feel I should give a grand farewell to this trilogy. Kings Field 1. Old, clunky, horrifically imbalanced, and yet somehow taking up less space than one of my Toho remixes, and set the baseline for the franchise to come. Told a simple but welcome story about a man wanting to find his father, and with one of the coolest final bosses in FromSoft's back catalog, at least in terms of pure design. Kings Field 2, the codifier of everything that would come later down the line, balanced in all the right ways, and started up the lore that this franchise would follow, but surprisingly cruel in its tricks and traps, and easily the most punishing game for both PS1 and player. And finally, Kings Field 3, the game that would unite everything under one banner. The best, most polished, but also the most linear and the actual hardest. God, I don't know how, but I grew a love for this franchise. We won't meet again until the PS2, so wherever Kings Field goes from here, I will follow with open arms. I am just glad I'm done with first-person dungeon crawling for a while. You gotta be fucking kidding me.